Lovely. Right, hi everybody, and welcome to this summary presentation where I'm going to be talking about climate adaptation, which is of course the topic within the theme for this year, particularly about why economic paradigms are core to this topic. And as I say, this is quite a deep conversation, and I am going to try and give a sort of whistle-stop overview so that it gives a platform for deeper discussions, both in the Q&A forum, but also for Vancouver when we can explore different aspects in more detail. So that gives you something to expect. Okay, so the two areas I'm going to be covering are the power of economic and organizational. And I say the two together because the economic paradigm is mirrored in the organizational paradigm in terms of their power over climate change and climate change adaptation. And then I'm going to talk about two big juxtaposing paradigms and what the implications are or might be for our ability to adapt and of course mitigate against climate change. Okay. So firstly, just a little bit about me. I know you've seen the bio. If you've seen the introduction that Phil and I did, then you'll also have had a sense of who I am. But I'm just going to give a very brief overview here. I'm a visiting fellow of Cambridge University Judge Business School, and I'm also a senior associate and a faculty member of University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I used to be an associate professor of marketing and sustainable business. And before that, I was a management consultant with Accenture. I do quite a lot of work in the ISO space, and for the last few years, I've been convening what will be the first truly global consensus view of governance of organizations. We're producing a guidance standard, which will be ISO 37000. That should be, there's a zero that I left off there. And also co-leading an ad hoc group on indicators for governance accountability and decision making. Previously, this group has actually now closed. I was a member of the task group developing the methodology for SDG indicator 12.6.1, and there's a report now out on that if you're interested to look at that. And I'm a non-executive director of the Soil Association Certification Limited, and that's the organization that certifies organic produce and the biggest certifier of FSC wood in the UK. And I'm also director of a small family retail business. The power of economic or organizational paradigms. So economics at its heart is about transforming scarce resources into well-being. And in theory, for all of us, not just a few, it would be a strange economic system that was just about creating outputs of well-being for a few, although many would argue that is essentially the system we have, but that's another discussion and debate. Sustainability is about being able to do this over the long term. So sustainability is about scarce resources into well-being, and again about doing that over the long term, which you could argue really needs to be at the heart of economics anyway. And therefore, that's why I see the goal, fundamentally the goal of economics and fundamentally the goal of sustainability are the same thing, or they should be. And that perhaps tells us something about some of the issues, or the issues we face, is that those things have ended up not being the same thing. And by that, I would say that we have perhaps forgotten what the task of economics actually is. And instead, we focus myopically on a part of this task. And that therefore hinders our ability to mitigate climate change and to adapt to it. So that's the core thesis. And this is what's called Dalys' triangle. Herman Daly is one of the first and most prominent ecological economists. And this triangle was adapted by Donella Meadows of Meadows and Meadows Limits to Growth, which we, myself and colleagues in Judge Business School, further adapted. And the key thing to say here is what Herman Daly focuses on is that these, in the middle here, you have the intermediate means and the intermediate ends. So this is sort of the producing money to get more money, you know, producing jobs so that more people can have jobs. The sort of being stuck in a small loop. And you could argue that's where our economics has ended up at the moment. Absolutely focused on producing intermediate ends from intermediate means. And what we've forgotten is that that economy rests on ultimate means. And sustainability to date has mostly been about highlighting the natural capital on which our economy relies on, and making us be aware of the fact that we are jeopardizing the ability for us to do what we think is important in this middle circle. So that really has been what a lot of people, when they think of sustainability, have focused on. And where I think we've got stuck in this humans versus environment, sustainability versus human development, everything that in fact in 1979 Brundtland and the Brundtland report was trying to overcome, but I think we might only just be getting there now, is the fact that sustainability is not just about focusing on the ultimate means, it's also about focusing us on the ultimate ends. And that those ultimate ends are well-being. And again, what do we mean by that? That is the deepest philosophical question. What is a good life? What is it to be, and I don't use the term happy because we know happy as a construct is very different to a eudaimonic sense of a good life, of well-being. Interestingly, under here, you have a list of what could be seen as universal human needs. So this question of how human needs connects with well-being. Of course, in the Brundtland definition of sustainability, the term needs is used, which I think perhaps was a shame that they didn't use well-being at that point, because I think whilst needs and well-being are connected, I think the term needs is more difficult for people to pin down more easily and to understand what it really means. So, so we can see here, therefore, that sustainability and the economy are really one and the same thing. And if we can get a sustainable economy, we have sustainability. And that, I think, is one of the first core messages to bring up here. But the main point I wanted to make at this particular moment was that we have got stuck here. And that's what the business as usual paradigm has taken us to that place. And I want to then therefore unpick that. So why do we focus so narrowly? Why can't business and organizations of all kinds, including universities as a key organizational structure, see that the economy is not working in the most extreme sense? And do we do all that we can to change it? You know, why don't we invest in adaptation measures that just make common sense? You know, I mean, I think all of us in this space of climate change and sustainability are, you know, it's distressing the extent to which what is just common sense just meets brick walls often. And why is that? And of course, these are fundamental questions that all of us in, you know, outside and inside the business and organizational space are trying to answer. But I think looking at economic paradigms helps us to do this more clearly. So here we have a not the most beautiful diagram I've ever drawn, but I think does the job when I break it down. So this is a business as usual paradigm. You could call this neoclassical, as in it draws from neoclassical economic thinking, but as more of a political ideology, it's known as neoliberal economic theory. It could be called free market economics, laissez-faire economics, and it draws very much from Friedmanite thinking. So, and what this logic, this overall logic of the economy is that well-being or welfare or utility, in the language of this business as usual, is the outcome of a functioning free market. So the assumption is that consumers who are self-interested, utility maximizing and rational, that means that they are committed to try to increase their own good, as in their own welfare, their own utility, and that when they engage in the market, they can understand what it is that will increase their well-being, and they understand what they need to buy in order to do that. So the theory is that in order for that to happen, the market has to be free to compete, free to give as much choice as possible, to be able to move to meet the utility demands of customers. There has to be perfect information, which is obviously an ideological state. There's never exact perfect information, but that's what the model is trying to get to the position of having. So you need to get to the point that there is nothing obstructing an individual's ability to know what's best for their own well-being, because otherwise that system falls down. And you therefore need as little government interference as possible, because you need a free market that isn't being swayed in ways that might disrupt consumers' ability to meet their well-being through the market. So in that theory, the role of companies then becomes very much abstracted from the goal of well-being. Companies are not there to be thinking about well-being. In fact, the idea of a customer's utility preference is something outside of the economic model. They're certainly not there to try to influence those preferences. And I know, try not to laugh at this point, because we all know the extent to which business through marketing does exactly influence society. But they wouldn't necessarily, no marketer would necessarily stand up and say that. In fact, Rory Sutherland of the advertising agency stood up and did exactly that. And by doing that, exposed how unusual it was. He said, I'd rather be evil than a bad marketer. And what he was, and he was calling out the elephant in the room. So, but let's just hold the theory for a minute, because this is important. This is what guides the system and guides the behavior of organizations. That companies, as long as they're focused on profit maximization for their shareholders, then they are able to know that they're doing a good job. So as long as they are playing with the rules, within the rules of the game, and the rules of the game is legislation, which guards against negative externalities. Not the company's role to think about negative externalities, that's the government's role. And government and society should hold organizations in check by saying, thou shalt not do these things. But other than that, they can do what they like. And as long as they are maximizing profits in an agnostic, values-free way, then they are doing the best that they can for well-being. But their role is not to think about well-being. It is an outcome of the market. And of course, they also create jobs, and that seemed to be an additional input into well-being. So I think you can probably, and many of you probably already understand this, that there are a lot of issues with that way of thinking when it comes to sustainability. Companies become unable to see beyond the short-term impacts and risks if you're just focused on profit maximization for people who'd like that money now. It of course means that the role of the firm, as I said, is not to compensate for negative externalities. So the company shouldn't even, not only should it not be thinking about well-being, it shouldn't be thinking about anything that it's doing that might be counter to well-being, because that's not its job. That's the government's job. And obviously at the same time, and this is where you have some tensions, is that actually you want the government to be as small as possible in terms of interfering in the marketplace, but that's assumed to be as small as possible in general. So whilst its role is to stop negative externalities, a lot of lobbying goes on to try to stop them doing that job in the first place. And as we know, a lot of money and power has moved from governments to organizations. And that's where a lot of criticism is laid at the fact that organizations are now behaving in ways that's not even good for themselves, because they have now too much power in a system where actually they were supposed to be held in check. It means obviously that law becomes really critical and really the only way that society can temper the behavior of an organization, other than through their demands in the marketplace and what it is that they use to vote for with their money in terms of consuming. And obviously people are seen as consumers first and foremost. But it also means companies are obviously therefore really unable to lead society towards a different way of consuming, a different way of behaving, because whilst of course companies do influence society, they're not able to really take on that role because it goes against the philosophy of the free market. And therefore they can't say, no, our role is to help consumers be more sustainable in their consumption practices. Now, of course, we are seeing organizations doing just that. But the important point to recognize is that that is a deeply uncomfortable place, maybe at a level that is subconscious, that organizations can't actually, or individuals within them can't even articulate why that doesn't feel like something that they should be doing. And that's because actually in economic theory terms, and in the last 50, 60 years of sort of indoctrination of that, that is something that they shouldn't be doing. So we've had that system, as I said, last 60, 70 years, and in sort of in the US and UK and Western societies in the 80s and 90s, that became very, very powerful as an ideological way of viewing the world. And then we've had all this system feedback, and these are just some of them, of course, but we've had the financial crashes that said, yeah, maybe that system doesn't work very well. We've had, of course, mounting evidence about wealth concentration despite rising poverty. We've had mounting evidence about the destruction of the natural asset base and inefficiencies of delivering well-being through the free market. And we've had crisis of a fundamental well-being globally and across rich nations and poor countries. So anxiety, depression, obesity, malnutrition. So of course, we've had lots of pockets of really great progress in some fundamental areas. But now the evidence that we have is that even that progress is under huge threat, as well as the fact that certain other markers are going in absolutely the wrong direction. But because of how profoundly encompassing the business as usual economic logic has been, you can see why, if you're not quite aware of that, but deep in your culture, you believe it to be the best thing. And you believe that when you're running an organization, that being profitable is the way that you contribute to society, even if you can't articulate that, then this evidence is going to be quite threatening. And you can see why a denialism at the deepest level comes in, because if your identity is built on one logic, then you're going to sort of, and of course we know that we're biased and we want to, we put more value on evidence that supports what we feel comfortable with and what we already think, then of course we're going to ignore this information and we're going to try and cherry pick information that says, actually, this has been a really good project and look at all the wonderful well-being that's been created throughout the world. So we've had this sort of, over the last, I'd say, 15 years, a sort of a rocky plateau of paradigm shift where it's really, really started to come to the head. And what I'm going to present now in terms of the fundamentally different paradigm is what I see has kind of come out of that clash of breakdown of the old paradigm and the 7/8 financial crisis, when really for the first time ever perhaps, mainstream was asking, is this the right system? Is this system actually working? This business as usual economic theory, is it really doing the right thing? And a lot of people were sort of, well, we've just gone back to the way things were, but you could see that conversations were shifting. And when we talk about a purpose-driven organization, for me, that is the response that has popped out the other end. The hope, the revolutionary, quite radical way of transforming the logic is contained within this discussion of purpose-driven organizations, as long as we can get it right and hold true to it, rather than it becoming just another way of companies looking good. So just briefly, I think you probably all heard of paradigm shift. This is Kuhn, of course, and he talked about this within an academic context. But we know that you have a sort of dominant way of thinking, and you might get sort of areas of thinking related to that dominant thinking that come off, but they're still broadly within the same paradigm, which is that sort of mental map, a coherent way of viewing the world. And then every now and then, when there's enough evidence that suggests that that way of thinking does not have a coherence, that there's too much evidence that means that you have to rework your whole kaleidoscope map, you move to a new paradigm. And I think that is what is happening now. And I'm just going to take you through a couple of alternatives or tweakings, you might say. So tweakings of the existing paradigm that I think you'll recognize that have come out within the academic and business space. And then the purpose-driven paradigm, which marks a radical shift, but all within the realm of capitalism, and that's important to say. So the first is CSR. So just very briefly, I mean, we know that there is a huge body of research on CSR, corporate social responsibility, and that includes both you know, narrow traditional CSR and broad CSR, and broad CSR can be very much like purpose-driven organization concept and literature. But I'm going to focus in on the traditional CSR, because when you look out to business and you see how they interpret the term CSR and how it's landed within business, it really does take its roots from the core of the traditional CSR and then interprets it in a certain way. So this is Carroll's pyramid from 1979. And you can see here that whilst it pushed the boundaries beyond this Friedman view that said, actually, the moral responsibility of an organization is to not engage at all with anything beyond profitability, Carroll's pyramid said, no, actually, there are other things that an organization needs to do to be a valid part of society. But still at the very base of it was profits. So profits were that base thing that formed the moral obligation of the organization. And that then becomes essentially within organizations, it becomes an add-on. So, and here's a quote from some research that we've done. And this is Megan Ramsey, who used to be brand manager of Dove for Unilever, and now is partner with Brunswick. And she says, if you think about corporate social responsibility, it kind of feels very bolted onto an organization. It's often one of the first things that gets hit by budget cuts. It's often one of the things that most people dismiss as not core to their business strategy. So that's how CSR has been interpreted. So it's within the business as usual logic, but you've kind of added on some kind of compensatory mechanism to mostly to preserve your reputational risk. So it's like, well, we want to make profits and we want to make them in the short term for our shareholders. But if we have a huge scandal, or if people think that we're really a bad citizen, then we're not going to get a lot of people buying our products as much as they would otherwise, and we might actually lose credibility completely. So we need to have some philanthropic actions. We need to be engaging in our society, but only to the extent that we are minimizing risks to our near-term profit. So very reactive, very still short-term focused, and still primarily that the reason for this organization existing is still profit maximization. So you can see that here, CSR, you could say, is one of the sort of streams off the business as usual paradigm. And then you have enlightened shareholder value, so often called ESV. Now, enlightened shareholder value is everything about that last paradigm, but with the difference that profits are focused on not in the short term, but in the longer term. Now, the fiduciary duty of a board of any company is the success of the company over the longer term. So actually, that should have always been there, but it got the system itself veered towards short-termism. So ESV, enlightened shareholder value, is a sort of correction of that. And what it does is bring in the absolute logic of sustainability, that common sense stuff. Because as soon as you say, no, we want to be around for the longer term, and we want to maximize our profits for our shareholders, but over the longer term, then suddenly you have to think completely differently. You have to have a systemic viewpoint. You have to recognize that you have stakeholders that form your system of value creation, and that if you don't look after them, you're not going to be able to deliver those profits. And that's why enlightened shareholder value can sometimes look a bit like stakeholder capitalism. It isn't, and I'm not going to go into that this session because there isn't time, but it can look a lot like that, because actually it means you have to think about your stakeholders. Now, Kramer and Porter's shared value also falls into this category, because essentially you're looking for win-wins project by project. And what we could see in the old business as usual is that actually businesses had been cushioned from the effects on their long-term profits. They weren't paying the real cost of getting those short-term profits, and that cushioned them from the realities that at some point that price would have to be paid. So moving to a long-term perspective, suddenly you're thinking, I'm going to have to pay that debt at some point. It's going to come home to roost. How can we make sure that that doesn't happen? So it seems like a small shift, but it's fundamentally huge to change in the way that businesses think. But it's not that fundamentally huge, because you're still within a profit maximizing logic. Everything about that old system of how you deliver well-being remains the same. So it's long-term, but it's still contained. You're still trying to, your focus is the self-interested persistence of that organization in order to get as much cash out of the system as you can for your shareholders. So this is about sufficiency. It's about saying, how can we make our current business model work over time? And okay, we might have to change that business model, but you're starting from a position of, you know, let's try and persist. So when we think about ESV and CSR in terms of climate change adaptation, well, I mean, firstly, looking at CSR, you know, and the business as usual paradigm, adaptation, you're not going to engage in climate change adaptation unless it's seen as a short-term threat to your profitability. If it is, then you'll do something about it. But of course, the nature of climate change adaptation is that you have to think ahead, and you have to be able to prepare for something that's coming longer down the line. So CSR and business as usual are incompatible, really, with understanding the issues and the threats of climate change and doing anything in terms of adaptation. In terms of ESV, the organization is able to recognize and implement changes to the extent that it's seen as a threat to long-term profitability. And of course, climate change is a threat to that. And that's where we're starting to see a lot of mainstream businesses moving on this topic and starting to work with local governments and starting to, you know, understand and put these sorts of things on their risk registers. And it's also about saying, well, I might be okay, but actually me being okay can only be understood in the context of my broader system. So how are my suppliers? You know, are they set up for adapting to climate change? Because if they're not, then who's going to supply me in 5-10 years? So let's collaborate with them and try and get some innovative funding in order to make sure that we are in a position to adapt. So you will see behaviors with an organization that has an ESV mindset that will be very different to those with a mainstream business as usual. So again, you can see here ESV, another of these sort of tails off the main paradigm, and all within the realm of capitalism. So purpose, what is purpose? Now you'll have heard this term, I'm sure, be talked about over the last sort of 5-10 years. It's really, really gained in prominence. It's become more talked about and written about than sustainability in a business context. And we've had some prominent discussions that some of you might or might not have seen. So on the left here, we have Larry Fink, who's the CEO of the biggest asset manager in the world. So $13 trillion of wealth, I believe, but it's now taken on a role in the federal government where the powers that it has extend beyond its ability to move that money around the world. Now, Larry Fink in 2018, 19, and now 20 has made his annual letter to CEOs about purpose. And what he's essentially saying, and I think this is important to note, that many governments are failing to prepare for the future, he says, on a range of issues. And as a result, society is increasingly turning to the private sector and asking that companies respond to broader societal challenges. Indeed, the public expectations of your company have never been greater, he says. Society is demanding that companies, both private and public, serve a social purpose to prosper over time. So that's a big shift. And then we had, in a related way, we had the Business Roundtable, probably energized by what Larry Fink said in 2019, redefining its purpose of business as not being about profit maximization for shareholders, but to serve, to be an economy that serves all Americans. So a hugely profound shift. Now, at the moment, these are intentions and they are words, and a lot of people are saying, well, where's the action? But of course, the intent has to become first. So it's a sort of watch and see, really, and how do we hold these companies accountable? So anyway, this is a term that's been used a lot. and is being, here we have in 2020, purpose is the engine of long-term profitability. So what's interesting here, I'm going to unpick purpose now, is that they're using the language of purpose, and a lot of what's being said can be interpreted as purpose, but actually a lot of it sounds a lot like enlightened shareholder value, that statement being one of them. So the question is, what is their fundamental intent? How revolutionary is their thinking? Or are they on a journey to revolution? So here we have that same diagram from before. So this is exactly the same diagram. I just wanted to pull it up again so that you could be reminded of the system and how well-being is an output from individual consumers within a free market. The company focuses on profit maximization. So a purpose-driven company, and purpose not in the sense of the reason, but in terms of purpose in this context is about a meaningful reason to exist. And if you look at the work of, which I'll focus on in a minute here, Viktor Frankl and others who've spoken a lot about well-being and meaningfulness, will say that to live a meaningful life is our core motivation, and that delivering the well-being of others, the good of others, is the source of that meaningfulness. So when we talk about purpose in the context of a purpose-driven organization, it really means to be driven by delivering the well-being of another. And so when you take that into this market logic, you can see that suddenly companies are focusing directly on delivering well-being. So they're saying that we don't think that this market can, in and of itself, deliver well-being. We as organizations need to be focused on delivering that well-being outcome through an appropriately regulated market. So the market, it's still a capitalist system. The market is still key. That free exchange is still very important, as long as it's appropriately regulated, so as that the well-being outcomes are not unduly affected by the system of the market. So consumers will be consuming within the market, but companies will have their end sight on that well-being, and what they put into the market will be in order to drive the well-being, but they might also focus on non-market solutions for in order to increase that well-being. So you get a combination of these approaches. And of course, sales and profitability are absolutely core for any organization, even charities. You are producing things that are supposed to be of value, and people are engaging in that, and that will be sales, depending whether you charge a monetary price or someone has to use their effort. There's an exchange where at some point you have to sell something, and you have to be profitable. You have to have enough excess reserves in order to be able to continue and invest and to do what you're doing, and ideally to grow within your market. And that doesn't mean growing the market to a point that you're unsustainably selling products, because if you're focused on well-being, you wouldn't do that. And this is why purpose represents such a huge shift, because it's focused on well-being directly. And there are a huge number of other implications that come from that. So in terms of going back to this Dalys triangle, you can see that sustainability is focused on, well, let's start here first. Purpose and sustainability both have their focus on well-being. They're both about having that as the main outcome. In terms of your ultimate means, purpose still, if you're going to deliver well-being in the long term, you have to have a focus on doing that sustainably. So you have to have all of the long-term thinking that says, we can't do it by destroying our natural capital base. It's just common sense, as long as you want to deliver that well-being over the long term. So sustainability is complementary and also embedded, you might say, within purpose. But purpose specifically is about focusing on this unlimited human desire, this unlimited means, not limited, but unlimited desire of humans to serve the well-being of others. So whereas the market logic previously was about self-interested, utility maximizing people who are rational, purpose twists that and says, okay, lots of things drive us, but one of the core things that drives us that we've been ignoring is that we are emotionally, hugely emotionally driven to serve others. And if we can harness that, then we are able to fulfill other people's well-being much better. And of course, we create a very different organizational environment and system of rewards and incentives, etc., if that's how we view people primarily. Doesn't mean to say, like Daniel Pink said, obviously, money is a hygiene factor. You've got to get it right. But if you really, really want to go out there and produce something amazing and get huge levels of productivity, you have to do that because you are meaningfully engaged, because it's purposeful for you. Okay, so, and just to just dwell slightly on that, because it's such an important point. Lots of people talk about purpose, but they forget that this is intertwined with this motivation to serve others. This is Viktor Frankl's work, his book, Man's Search for Meaning. I very much recommend reading that. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only a lack of meaning and purpose, as he says. Success in life is living a purposeful life. And purpose is based on universal values of what is good. And interestingly, he says here, and this tells you something about the dynamics of the logic and what that means for a business, is that success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, so it must result. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. So what we are talking about here, when we see that purpose-driven organizations, and there's a range of data that suggests that they are hugely outperforming other organizations on a range of fundamental basis of the traditional profit maximization, actually. Including things like employee satisfaction, retention, customer loyalty, all of these sorts of things. But they do that, it does that as a side effect that the organization is genuinely intending to increase the well-being of others. And the moment at which they start to say, we're doing this because we think it's going to make us more profit, then that magic is lost. So there's something very interesting in there about the nature of the intent and how important that intent is for driving the outcomes. Okay. So briefly to say, when we talk about organizational purpose, then when an organization is saying, well, whose well-being are we focused on, in what way, I think drawing us back to everything we talked about the economy and sustainability, this long-term well-being for all becomes this sort of meta purpose. That's essentially what we're saying, or what I'm proposing, and what I hear everything pointing to. And if it's something else, then that's the debate we need to have. But let's just assume for a moment that that long-term well-being for all is our humanity's shared purpose. Then each company's role is to say, well, what can we do to contribute to that? What's our purpose within that? And the fact that they are anchored to this shared purpose means you get the ability to collaborate, because ultimately, if you scale up, if you say, well, my purpose is this, I'm doing this part of the puzzle, I'm delivering sanitation in Africa, you know, I'm trying to create gender equality, but ultimately you are all anchored to this shared purpose, and therefore there is a common platform that unites all organizations and allows for collaboration, especially on these global issues like climate change and sustainability, in a way that wasn't possible before. And Colin Mayer talks about that, so that's what purpose was. And in terms of, therefore, in today's context, what a purpose ought to be, in terms of its specifics, Colin Mayer talks about solving problems of people and planet, and not profiting from creating problems for people or planet. So that's really the sort of way in which you might think about formulating your purpose statement. So I'm not going to go into this now, but it's really to just bring all of those diagrams together, and you have purpose here. It's systemic, it's long-term, it's proactive, so it's front-footed. The constraints around innovation are less, because you're not trying to optimize profits primarily. You're trying to optimize a well-being outcome, and how you do that is not dependent necessarily on where the most money in the market can be gained. And you're very much freed from traditional sense of what the business does and how it does it. Again, I won't dwell too much on this because of time, but just to say that purpose, because your core reason for being is now not profitability. Profits are an outcome of focusing on well-being. It comes from a very different logic, and it is done well, aligned with sustainability and aligned with what economics should be trying to produce. So in theory, we now have a logic of economics and a logic of capitalism that, at least in theory, should be able to deliver us sustainability. The next set of questions, which is what my research is on and what I can delve into in more detail in Vancouver, is, well, what in detail does that look like? How do we get from where we are to there when everything is set up to deliver something different, et cetera, et cetera. So a huge number of questions about how we transition and how we do that quickly. So the question is really, in terms of climate change adaptation, mitigation, and all other sustainability issues, purpose does appear to be the only paradigm that's really compatible with achieving that in the timescales we have. I think enlightened shareholder value can get very close, but my observations are that the mindset that comes with that and the focus on profitability, even in the longer term, constrains some of the innovation that we need. But again, that's to be continue to be researched and understood. So will purpose become the new paradigm of capitalism? Will that not work? Will we throw out capitalism and have a much more centrally controlled system? You could argue that if we want to maintain business as usual, neoclassical neoliberalism, and solve sustainability, we would need a highly regulated market, highly regulated. And is that the kind of capitalism that we want either? Will that stunt innovation? So these are the sorts of questions that need to be asked. So that's really what I wanted to open out to talk about today, is why I think that economic paradigms are so critical for all of us, whatever it is we're studying, whatever discipline we come from, why these logics are not just held within organizations, they're held within the economy and they're held within society. Even in our own personal lives, the extent to which we believe the business as usual logic is quite deep, actually, if we really question it. And also that view of human behavior about being self-interested, about focusing primarily on what money that we can get. And of course, we've been shaped as consumers in ways that perhaps with what we face today are unhelpful. So, so those are my conclusions. Tweaks have happened, but they're not enough. But we now have a quite radical potential to shift the view of capitalism. The question is, has it got enough potential to win out, or will it just end up slipping back to business as usual? And my closing thought, which I'd like to explore at some point, and maybe this will be what I'll focus on in Vancouver, is how purpose-driven are universities? If a lot, sorry for the spelling there, then in what ways? You know, what evidence do we have to say that they're purpose-driven? And if they're not purpose-driven, and actually they're another really good example of being driven by that business as usual logic, even if they don't realize that they are, then what would be different about them? What would they look and feel like if they truly were purpose-driven? And I think that is probably one of the most important questions as researchers, that we also, not just as researchers, as society, you know, what is the role of universities in society, and are they really fulfilling it? So thank you. Thank you.